Hey friends, it's time for another silver update with our good friend Jeff Nielson from SilverGoldBull. Jeff, welcome back.
Hi, Sean. Always a pleasure to be here.
It's always a pleasure to have you. A couple of things I want to talk about today. Number one, the CFTC reportedly is going to be dropping its silver manipulation investigation. I want to get your input on that, but first let me say for the shills out there who want to take the side of JP Morgan on this and the CFTC, I think it's hilarious that people would malign silver bugs and that these people would now say, oh look, there was never any manipulation, these silver bugs are insane. Meanwhile, we live in a world, Jeff, where we have endless bond fraud, which Jim Willie has spoken about, the John Corzine MF Global theft, the LIBOR scandal, which affects the entire world's financial system, the HSBC drug money laundering scandal, and JP Morgan itself is currently being investigated by 11 state, federal, and international bodies. So it leaves me at a loss, Jeff, that these shills want to take the side and be, I think, willfully ignorant and take the side of JP Morgan and take the side of the bad guys and say, oh, look, there's no manipulation. But what do you make of this news of the CFTC to drop the silver manipulation investigation?
Well, I think first of all, I'm going to borrow a quote from my friend Chris Powell over at GATA in a recent interview. And, he was asked about bullion manipulation in general, and his quip was, well, if bullion markets aren't being manipulated, then they're the only markets in the world that aren't. And, of course, that just basically echoes what you were just saying with all of your, summarizing of our world of fraud. And, for me, when I look at the CFTC, or this word about the CFTC supposedly dropping its investigation, and then, of course, for the absurd excuse that there was a quote-unquote lack of evidence, my conclusion is the exact opposite. They need to drop the case because they can't actually conclude an investigation because there's so much evidence that it would be impossible to apply a coat of whitewash thick enough to cover it all.
We live in a world of fraud. Ron Hara calls it a computer-driven dream world. We've got high-frequency trading. We've got just endless scandal, endless theft from Wall Street against the people. And for the CFTC to not basically have the balls to stand up to JP Morgan, well, that makes a lot of sense because JP Morgan is an arm of the Fed. JP Morgan is in bed with the Fed. The Fed is the government. JP Morgan is the government. It's corporatocracy. It's a fascist government. Of course, they're not going to stand up for what's right and what's true. They can't, which I think speaks to how important the silver market and physical silver and the manipulation of the precious metals is to this current paradigm and to the cabal, correct?
Well, yeah, excuse me, and there's two dimensions to this. First of all, there's the canary in the coal mine role of these markets being our warning signs to alert people, when things are going awry. And, of course, that's one of the main reasons for suppressing it. So simply, seeing these markets rise above the manipulation and go towards some semblance of fair value, would be a very important development in terms of raising awareness, for among the sheep, who are still totally asleep. And then, of course, second, reason for wanting to see that the sector thrive is that this is, people's escape hatch, from getting away from this world of fraud. You can take your wealth out of the paper fraud system, put it into physical metal, and protect yourself, individually at least, from the deprivations of the bankers.
Well, let's stay with that theme of the banksters. You've written recently on your great blog over there at SilverGoldBull.com, The Crime of the Millennium. And I just want to read for folks just this brief intro, and then you take it from there, because we're talking about the same people, the central banks that are manipulating physical precious metals. These are the same people that you're writing about here. And you write, I quote, "As few people in our societies even know, all of the world's government have foolishly granted exclusive monopolies for the printing of all the world's currencies, our money, to a cabal of privately owned corporations called central banks." You go on to say, "Understand that the monopoly to print money is nothing less than a license for economic rape, and it's history's single greatest act of legal theft." For most people that are listening to us right now, Jeff, we know that, but to hear you articulate it, and for those who don't know the information, you just hit the nail on the head. We are up against a banking cabal, a mafia organization, if you will.
Well, and that's exactly what it is. They duplicate the operations of the mafia in every respect. And, of course, we were just talking about the CFTC. Well, it's not like the CFTC never engages in enforcement operations. If you check, their roll call of enforcement actions, you'll see a significant list. But what they do is they pick on the small fish. And of course, this is just what the mafia does. They eliminate their small criminal competitors so they can have a total monopoly on their various, empires of crime. And this is exactly how the banking cabal works. The regulators, of course, never do anything to actually interfere with the oligarchs themselves, but they're wonderful for both covering up their crimes and for, stomping on any, small crime competitors that might want to muscle in on their action.
Well, I think this is a perfect segue to tie it all together with the fact that our sovereignty in this nation is being threatened by the United Nations. It's being threatened by this New World Order cabal, which I've always maintained, and I think you'd agree, at the top of this cabal sits the Bank of International Settlements, the IMF, the central banks of the world, the World Bank, and what do they all have in common? They're all beholden to these same banking interests, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, those that own the Federal Reserve own this international conglomerate. This international organized crime wants to steal from us not only our wealth, but our sovereignty. And you write about that in your very latest article, Bankers Stealing Our Wealth and Our Sovereignty. Tell folks about that, because this is the crux. This is the absolute epitome, the center, the bullseye of the enemy of humanity. It's the banksters.
Well, and the one phrase that I tend to sort of shy away from is that moniker New World Order, because for me, I look around and I see absolutely nothing new. We see these old, incredibly corrupt, obscenely rich houses that are simply going around and trying to loot all the wealth of the world and literally enslave us all with debt. And this is what it amounts to. It's not even so much a matter of them simply trying to accumulate wealth, but rather to accumulate power and control to make us their debt slaves. And this is what where the loss of sovereignty comes into it, because our governments have become debt slaves, through these fraudulent bond debts that have been racked up. And, of course, through simply allowing the bankers to gain much too much influence into policy making. And so, we have this cabal of bankers, the European Central Bank, issuing this bulletin that simply stated, in rather innocuous terms, that Greek bonds would no longer be eligible as collateral. Well, it doesn't sound like anything too dramatic, but then, I explained what that euphemism actually means, and basically it was a declaration that Greek bonds are now worthless. And, of course, if you declare that a nation's bonds are worthless, then, essentially that immediately locks a nation out of the debt markets. And, of course, when you're already at an insolvent status and you're cut off of further credit, that amounts to a declaration of bankruptcy. So, that seemingly innocuous phrase from the European Central Bank was literally their declaration that the nation of Greece is bankrupt. And so, I pointed out the outrage of a small cabal of foreign bankers being able to simply declare that an entire nation was bankrupt, simply because in their world this was how they were going to treat them. And obviously, that is a loss of sovereignty. And as I also noted in the article, it's a loss of sovereignty that cannot exist with nations that are on a gold standard.
No, you're right. Nations that aren't on a gold standard and are beholden to the fiat paper printing presses of this cabal are literally at the mercy of the cabal. Now, what they're doing to Greece is exactly what they want to do to the rest of the EU nations so that they can maintain total control. And ultimately, they're going to turn that apparatus around on this nation, which is the world's greatest debtor nation. I just did an interview recently with Suzanne Pozelle, who's a skilled writer over at OccupyCorporatism.com, and Suzanne says that they know this system is coming down, and it can't be held up, which is in line with what Harley Schlanger told me on my recent interview with him when he said this system cannot survive much longer. The rats are literally jumping off the sinking ship. Because they know this system is coming down and it can't be held together, that's why they're rolling out these martial law plans. That's why they're militarizing the police. That's why they want to lock down these nations so that when the nations fall, we're all under the complete control of a tyrannical police bankster state. What do you make of what I just said? Is there any way they can stitch this thing together? And if they can't, what does the end game look like for the common man? What's it look like for me? What's it look like for you? What's it look like for anybody who doesn't have precious metals in physical form?
Well, for the answer to that, I would simply say, look at the explosion in the construction of quote-unquote private prisons and detention centers across the U.S. these things are mushrooming up. And, something that I've been writing about, and, not a lot of other people seem to have taken notice of, is this insane discrepancy in housing statistics from the U.S. housing sector. And what you'll see is every single month, the new housing sales are only about half of the new housing starts. And this is month after month, year after year. Now, obviously, no business, can remain in business if you're only selling half of what you produce each month.
Thanks for watching Part 1. Don't miss Part 2, and be sure to visit sgtreport.com for all of my original content and the most important daily news. Thanks for watching.